So, my favorite podcast that I found most interesting was actually about JetBlue and its founder. Um, and part of that was just the background, the information that I didn't have any idea about before, but also just the idea of going into that market, an airline industry being particularly overcrowded and not profitable, and coming away with a company that's really kind of become such a success. So that really kind of struck a chord with me. But so JetBlue, of course, has been around since 2000, and it kind of, they entered as a competitor of a discount airline, kind of standing out against the generic market of the legacy airlines, where they offer similar to Southwest Airlines. In fact, they were modeled after Southwest Airlines, but they offer a lot of other premium stuff that the other airlines offer, like videos and better food and electronic tickets. That they were one of the first to do that. Um, so what was interesting to me about all of that and the origins of that really come from the founder's upbringing and his life experiences. So the idea of serving customer service is rooted in his Mormon faith, and he actually, I what I of course didn't know either was that he was involved in so many other airlines before this, and then airlines have been even post JetBlue. We'll get to that in a second. He's still founding airlines. So his first actual experience in the industry was as a college dropout in the early 80s when he was in his early 20s, and he started out by buying timeshares in Hawaii and bundling those with airline tickets uh, from Los Angeles. And he would market those to people in Utah, saying you can get to Hawaii if you just drive to Los Angeles, and you can spend a whole week. Here's the timeshare, all bundled, but you have to drive to Los Angeles. And he was making a lot of money, and then suddenly the airline that he was using, bundling his tickets with, went bust, and he was out of work. So he went back home and did some other odd things for a while. But still, kind of, I guess he was fascinated with the industry. Went back into it. His next attempt, he chartered direct flights from Salt Lake City to Hawaii, and he kind of was more of a travel agency at first. He was leasing a chartered airplane, and it was really only flying 1 day a week, back and forth, round trip, and it was just sitting there for the other 6 days. And so he was approached by Steve Uvarhazy, who I didn't realize I'd seen his name. I work by the Air and Space Museum out in Chantilly that bears his name, but I had never really knew or bothered to look into his origins. But this kind of inspired me to do that. But he was uh, kind of a magnate in the airline industry, and he came and approached him and said, "Hey, um, I want to go into business with you, but I'll lease you airplanes, but you got to be a legit airline." So that kind of inspired him to start his actual first airline, and that was known as Morris Airlines, and it was he was named after his business partner at the time. And so that was kind of interesting too, because I always wondered, like, how do you go into business? You would think owning an airline, you have this all kinds of capital and all the equipment and machinery required, but it started off just leasing a single airplane, so that was pretty cool. That airline allowed him to pay off his house, and he was doing so successfully, he was able to pay off his house in his mid 20s. That ended up being bought by Southwest Airlines, which is a company he idolized, and he was kind of taken on to work for Southwest Airlines, and he was kind of groomed. He kind of is implied that he would be Herb Kelleher's successor if he just kept his head down and do that. But of course, he couldn't do that. He kind of was like one of those people who rocks the boat. So after 5 months, he actually had to be let go. And after that, he went back home, and he had a 5-year non-compete clause because of Southwest, so he was out of the industry for a while. But during that time, he built the ticketless electronic system that was the first of its kind, or well, I guess the first one he bought actually was part of his old Morris Airlines, and was bought by Southwest, so they claim credit for it, but he actually did it. Um, so he built this, but he went and built another one, and they had this kind of apparatus ready to go. And when the 5 years was up, he started another airline, and it was built off of Southwest's model of customer service. But one of Southwest's kind of the opening he saw, what kind of made his airline JetBlue successful, was that he realized that Southwest skirted major airport routes, major hubs, and that was part of their model for making money. But he realized that there was an opportunity for a discount airline to step into that space and compete. And so that is where the origins of JetBlue came from. And of course, he added those frills that we're familiar with, the TVs, and he signed with Airbus for their planes. And the motto really was customer service, a customer service company that happens to fly airplanes. And that's not unique among new ventures, but he kind of developed that on his own. But the real emphasis was, again, on his background of servant leadership. He would even fly the planes on board. He would announce himself as the owner of the company, and he would stay behind to serve snacks and during the flight and clean the planes and go up and down the aisles just getting customer feedback, raw feedback from people, what they were doing well, what they needed to improve. And so that really fed into his culture. He hired people. He would interview people. And one of the questions was, what have you done to help other people? And if you couldn't answer that question, no matter how experienced of a pilot you were or whatever, you wouldn't be hired. So the company was profitable very quickly. They had some hiccups along the way, and they points out there was his downfall really came in 2007 due to his FAA regulations just really in effect for that 1 year. You couldn't fly during an ice storm. And so he was, there was a big, Valentine's Day of 2007, big ice storm. All the planes were grounded. It was a huge PR nightmare, and as a result of that, he was asked to step down, and he left the company. He went back to his home country where he was born in Brazil, and in 2008 started a brand new airline there that has risen to become one of the top airlines in Brazil, again using the same motto of serving routes that aren't otherwise being served. And even since then, he has a new plans to come back and start another new airline in the U.S. It still hasn't come about quite yet, but it's in the works. So his guiding principle has always been, it's not what happens to you, but how you deal with it. And his kind of mantra as a person, as a leader, is making other people's lives better. He wants to be remembered for making other people's lives better. And so he always asks his employees, like, is this the best job you ever had? And if it's not, then he looks for ways to improve it and make it that way. So the culture and the background leading up to the JetBlue, and the whole idea behind that was really, really eye-opening to me, and actually kind of makes me one of those almost feel-good stories about an airline, which you don't hear too much these days. So that summarizes the JetBlue podcast.